I'm Rabbi Sarah Horonsky, and I'm so delighted to be a part of the Valley community at Temple Beth Hillel. And we have an amazing panel that will be moderated today by Rabbi Richard Levy, who one of the best teachers around. Truly a rabbi and a friend to all. He was done many very important things, little principles here and there, theology, liturgy, spiritual development, sort of all wrapped up in a big bow and a gift when we get to learn with Richard Levy. He was the dean of HUC's rabbinical school for the first ordination class in LA in 2002. I got to be ordained underneath him in 2003, and it was a great gift, and it's an honor that you would be a part of this wonderful panel and help moderate about immigration reform through Reform CA. So I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
That was very lovely, and I hope you will read about my colleagues who are described even with pictures what was sent out by the Board of Rabbis. Thank you all for coming, and I'd like to say something first about who we all are and what we've been doing for the past year and a half, really under Steph's guidance. The people involved in Reform California have been determined to demonstrate that the carrying out of the moral mandates of Torah need to animate us, not only in the Bima, but in the public square and in the halls where laws are made and enforced. We are reminded, as a friend of many of ours, P.G. Levy said this past Shabbat morning at Leobek Temple, that last week's Parashah Shoftim addressed the need for justice in every element of living: government, courts, war and peace, the land and trees, human beings, and our communities. We in Reform California not only want to preach that Torah, but to act on it. We represent a number of congregational rabbis and lay people working together to illumine the role, the Jewish role, in fixing a broken society. We've negotiated with lawmakers in Sacramento and shared prayers for their success, and we have concentrated most immediately on trying to get past the Trust Act, about which you will hear more. But generally speaking, the Trust Act in California tries to correct a federal program that has become a wide net for deporting people who have committed very minor crimes, sometimes not crimes at all. Being here illegally, as you should know, is a civic and not a criminal matter. The bill that will go to the state Senate in a couple of weeks is the one that we and our partners in an interfaith coalition would like to see passed, and that we'd like Governor Brown to sign. Most of his proposals for amendments have been accepted, in part because of a lot of lobbying on the part of our coalition partners and Reform California. We seek his partnership in making the Trust Act a law. There will be a call-in to the governor on August 22nd, which Steph will talk about. But the governor has, I believe, until October 31st. 13th, sorry, reverse numbers, to sign or to veto the law. So a call for action on the High Holy Days is an appropriate thing to do, as is a letter to him, which has already garnered over 100 signatures just from Reform rabbis, and that copies of which will also be available. So we see this not as a political issue, but a religious one. And at Pesach, for example, we created a Haggadah, which translated the immigration issues into the themes of the Seder. On Shavuot, along with Clue LA, we created readings comparing the story of Ruth to the story of contemporary immigrants. On Tisha B'Av, we studied a midrash on one of the Haftarot of Tochecha in the light of contemporary injustices. and chanted Echa interspersed with contemporary laments about our own society. And while we are a group of Reform rabbis, we would love to link arms with a group called Conserve California, and another called Reconstruct California, or Renew California, or Torah True California, and many other possibilities as well. So today we are here to show how immigration issues can help inform the imperatives of the Day of Judgment and the Day of Atonement. How can we preach on issues like this without polarizing our communities? Steph is going to address that. What are sources in Torah texts, Makzor texts, which help inform our preaching? In the words of Pirkei Avot, how can we prevent justice delayed from being justice denied? Ken Chasen is going to be discussing that, and Joel Simonds will cite some sources in Torah and Makzor texts. How can the Al-Chetz focus us on the specific sins we have committed against people we should know all too well, the Ivrim, those crossing borders, as we have done from Abraham's time to our own great-grandparents, to some of us in this room. We will try to have a short time after each presentation for a couple of questions, and hopefully a longer one at the end. So it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague and our boss in this effort, Rabbi Stephanie Kolin.
Thanks, Richard. It's really wonderful to be here with you. I like how you're such a time optimist. We're going to have time for questions between and after. It's going to be amazing.
You have 45 minutes.
There you go.
That's why I'm always late.
It's really quite been my pleasure and honor to work with a tremendous team of rabbis and lay leaders who have led the campaign to pass the Trust Act and led the grand campaign that is Reform California, our attempt to organize the reform movement of California to act powerfully for justice in our state. And so we're really grateful to be here. Richard, I'm just going to pass these out a little bit because I didn't get them in ahead of time, not even close. So Richard said, we want to look at this as a religious issue and not a political issue, but we also know that, I got you guys. We also know that it's not easy to preach about a subject that is all bound up in the world of politics. My partners in this session will lay out beautiful immigration Torah and justice Torah, but we all know that setting the stage to preach justice or to preach something political that's wrapped up in not just a statewide conversation, but also a national conversation about legislation and who's going to vote for what and when. It's a complicated matter. And ultimately that each one of us in our own congregations, we have broad political spectrums. You know your own congregation best. And we all have to figure out what is best for our community and how they're going to actually be able to hear the words that we say. I think we often face this when it comes time to preach, when we have this opportunity. The most people that will ever be in front of us when we're preaching are in front of us right then and there. And we don't want somebody who maybe didn't even see the inside of the walls of our sanctuary since the last Yom Kippur to suddenly feel judged like they're an outsider because they're on the wrong side of an issue. So we know that what we say is important because we spend so much time writing it, but if the people before us can't hear it because we haven't figured out how to deliver it in a way that can seep through, then what are we doing with those 18 minutes of our rabbinate? So we know that some folks will come for the justice sermon, and they'll be excited to hear it and ready. But we also know that some people come to our sanctuary in order to seek sanctuary. That word comes from that same word, as it were. And seeking just that internal tshuva. And so I'm going to just offer 4 paradigms, 4 ways of coming at political conversation from the Bima. I am sure you have tried and true methods of your own, and I'm sure we can all learn from each other a great deal. So just these four, and some of them are related to texts in front of you. One is neutralizing the idea of politics, right? To come right at the question. I'm about to say some things that have a political bent to them, that have a political tone, and are wrapped up in the world of politics in our country. But here's what politics means to me, right? And sort of unpacking for folks, where does this word politics come from? Not as you might find, if you Google the word politics, you'll find that it comes from two words, actually. The word poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking creatures. That's not actually true. So how do we unburden the word from that? Teaching that it really comes from the word polis, which is the place in a Greek city where the people would come and decide together how they were going to live their lives together. What values, what laws, who were they going to be to one another? That's where politics comes from. And so it becomes a much more neutral tool if we can unburden it from what Pastor Brian McLaurin, which is on your sheet, writes in this great article he has, what do you mean by politics? And he says the problem is when politics comes to mean dirty politics or partisan politics or narrow wedge issue litmus test culture war politics. Right? So if we can rescue the idea that we all have to be in one place to face to determine who we're going to be to one another, that's politics. And that's how we're going to make these decisions together. One way of coming at it. A second way, teaching the balance between being in this internal high holy day moment and the direction that our prayers are intended to take us. But we do this all the time, measuring the internal with the external. And so there's a text here on your sheet from Breakout 34b. Rabbi Chia ben Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, a person should not pray, Ele b'vayit sheyesh sham chalonot, save for in a room which has windows. And the Shulchan Aruch goes on to expand upon that and says, actually those windows need to be placed on the eastern wall. And in the Shulchan Aruch, that's reminiscent of because we are facing Jerusalem. That's why it's on the eastern wall. But we also know that we face our bodies towards the eastern wall, which tells us that the windows aren't there just to let light stream in. We actually have to look out the window when we pray, right? So even as we have this responsibility to cast our eyes upward and cast our eyes and hearts inward, we're also demanded, our tradition actually demands us to cast our eyes outward and connect our prayer. And this great text by Kaplan also guides our thinking toward how is this prayer actually going to change me? What is it going to change about how I act in the world? And so we can tell our folks that it doesn't matter, actually, at the end of the day, we are all going to come down on an issue in a certain way. We're all going to make our own political decisions. When we get in a voting booth, we're going to vote our consciences and our souls. But the truth is we actually can't, it is part of our tradition to not excuse ourselves from letting our prayer cast our eyes out that window and tell us something about who we are in the world outside, not just who we are when we come into the sanctuary to pray for the high holy days. A second way of thinking about it. A third way, this is we use this all the time, this will not be rocket science, is story, right? Just to take it out of the realm of who on what side of the aisle is voting for what, is our 501c3 in jeopardy or is it not? Instead of the law and the legal and the, who do we champion or who is an obstacle to this legislation, just to tell the story of, the person we learned from, Rachel, who is a woman who was being beaten by her husband and felt she could not go to the police because contact with the police was almost definitely, she felt, going to result in her deportation and being separated from her children who were also being beaten by her husband. Just a face, the kid who did a program in school, learned to be someone who refused to be a silent witness when he saw an injustice, a kid, and he came back to his congregation, East Palo Alto, where his teacher was actually one of our congregants up in Betham, and he saw a crime being committed, and he decided he wasn't going to be a silent witness, and he called the police, and he ended up testifying against these perpetrators, and he got them arrested and all of those things, and he helped at his own great risk, and in the process they found out he was undocumented, and they had him arrested and deported for trying to be a good person, right? So can we put faces on the stories, or rather faces on the issues, so that it's not about where you're going to vote or who's going to vote for what, but it's about who is in pain right now, and as Jews, what is our responsibility to them? Just that simple. And then the last piece sort of answers a different question, which is not necessarily how do we talk politics, but how do we talk politics without crushing people's souls and having them walk out in this dark pall of hopelessness and powerlessness. And so, we preach big things, and there's lots of brokenness all around us in a lot of the issues that we deal with. And so what if we were able to give people action steps? What if we were to be able to invite people at the end of our message to say, and you don't have to live like this, and we have organized ourselves to figure out what we want to do about that. And so in this campaign that we're talking about, the action step on the High Holy Days that we'll be asking people is, you see on your sheet, to call the governor on, this is August 22nd, but also during the High Holy Days, to call the governor and tell him to sign the Trust Act that is on his desk to protect the 3 million immigrants living in California today.
One question? One question, briefly phrased. Okay. Yeah.
All of the information out there is about August 22nd, and I'm concerned that the impact will be, August 22nd is passed, so what's the next action step? And I'm not sure if Reform California has defined what that will be.
The email that will go out on August 27th will say that the second call that we need to make to the governor, so the Trust Act should pass the Senate on the 26th. After it's on, then it'll just be on his desk waiting for his signature. And that's when we have to have the hundreds of people call and say, sign it, sign it, sign it, sign it, sign it. And so
you're suspecting you'll be sending
there'll be a second call, yes.
Thank you.
Good question.
Rabbi Chasen.
Rabbi Kolin did a good job of just reinforcing a message that I think we all know, and that is that somehow we have to figure out how it is we apply the values of Torah to the real life facts on the ground that are prompting moral and yes, political debate in our society. The risk, of course, is that if we don't do that, Torah ends up becoming this very pristine ivory tower of ethical platitudes. That's the best case scenario for Torah. Is that it warms the heart. You get a chance to hear how beautiful things ought to be, but without application remains that distant. Worse yet, Torah, when we don't do that, becomes irrelevant. We become irrelevant. We talk about things that are not where the worshiper's conscience is preoccupied, and we end up left on the sideline of what is prompting the inner turmoil of the holy days. So each of us, of course, in our own ways, as Rabbi Kolin said, has to figure out that calculus. And each of the synagogues, of course, the places where we lead worship, they're all very, very different. There's those that have great comfort and those that have great discomfort when it comes to the broaching of political subjects. And so we meet the different approaches. What I want to talk about today is the idea of constructing a sermon for these coming High Holy Days where you're really giving a broader values sermon about what kind of society we want America to be. And here's an opportunity to give a sermon that is not specifically an immigration sermon, but where immigration becomes the key illustration and the most timely illustration of what it is we're talking about when we have a conversation about the way in which the America of our ideals is perhaps slipping away from us. And I think it's not only a softer way into the conversation, but it even for those congregations, and I happen to be blessed to work at a synagogue where there's an expectation that we're going to have these kinds of conversations at High Holy Days time. That's credited to my predecessors who did so regularly. So I have a great license when it comes to that, but I still feel that people, and even those who are the longtime members who are used to this kind of discourse, they come expecting that we are speaking to their souls, and it's not going to be just more of what they experience in the op-ed page. There has to become the religious and Jewish framework for them. And so where I'd like to begin, Levy had alluded to this a little earlier, it was a teaching from Pirkei Avot. It's Pirkei Avot 5:8, which talks about how violence enters into the world in a compelling way. It says that the sword comes into the world because of justice delayed and justice denied. Now, it's a very evocative teaching, I think, for our purposes here, because the consequences in America, when we allow the status quo to languish, are not just to those who are the direct victims of whatever oppression is being conscienced. It's not just the direct victims of injustice who suffer, according to that teaching from Breakout. All of us ultimately suffer because there's a callousness that enters into society when we allow these giant ills to seem too big for us to take on. Ultimately, everyone is targeted with increased violence. The amount of discord that is fomented among those who are disenfranchised, ultimately this comes back to haunt us as well. Increased violence, increased selfishness, all the things that we say we want the world not to be, we end up actually creating. Now that is certainly the kind of values refrain that our worshipers come to expect from us, they need from us at this time of year. And I think you can then very clearly demonstrate that working to advance common sense immigration reform is one very important way that we can push back against that callousness that I think we've allowed ourselves to introduce into society. We've all been really a part of. If you want to get specific, you can talk about how today's immigration system, justice is delayed for millions of family members who are facing decades-long backlogs in getting their visas. You can talk about how justice is denied to millions of undocumented immigrants who live in the shadows of our society. And Seth was talking about this very evocatively a moment ago. They're afraid to report crimes that they witness or even crimes that they are victims of for fear of what the police will end up doing to them. We can talk about how justice is delayed for all of the innocent children, thousands of them, who end up in foster care when their parents, who may well have been born in America, are deported. We can talk about how justice is denied to law-abiding men and women who know that something as simple as getting pulled over for a traffic ticket ends up being a lot more than just a fine for them is the risk of being deported. And so I think that it's fair for us to frame those corruptions of justice as a clear, plain degradation of our country's mission. Back in May, you might have seen it in the news, there was a study published by PolicyLink that talked about how 44% of Latinos, and this is whether they were in America unlawfully or lawfully, 44% of Latinos in the country are now less likely to notify police if a crime is being committed against them. And that includes those who are here illegally. There are just too many Latinos in our state, and frankly beyond our state as well, who now see police protection as a luxury item, and a luxury that they can't afford. We're an immigrant people ourselves in America, of course, and we think of this country as a place that has always been a safe harbor from that sort of fear, not a perpetrator of it. And so this is a great chance for us on the holy days to ask, are we forced now to ask ourselves whether we may not be that country anymore? That's a conversation that I think will itself not, on the face of it, seem too political for any congregation. And then, of course, the nuances and the way in which we get back to the specifics and the action. That leads me to the second text that I want to share briefly, and that is this past Tisha B'Av, Reform California held a worship and study event at my synagogue at Leo Beck Temple, and there our teacher, Dr. Louis Barth from Union College here in Los Angeles, also a member of our congregation, shared a beautiful and compelling teaching from Pesikta Rav Kahana that is a commentary on one of the summer haftarot, the haftarot of mourning. It is a lament in Isaiah chapter 1 about the corruption of justice and therefore the degradation of society in his time. And in the Midrash, which is commenting specifically on Isaiah chapter 1, verse 23. And if you'd like to have a copy of the text, I've got it, and I'd be happy to give you a copy of the text or send it to you electronically if you prefer. Rabbi Yochanan tells this story of how in times past a man would go up to Jerusalem seeking justice. He was going to plead his case in court, and the judge would say to him, well, why don't you split a couple logs for me? And after he would succeed in doing that, he would say, well, why don't you now fill a couple casks of water for me? And so on and so on. He would be off doing these random chores, and over the course of this time, both in the expense of doing the work and also the expense of the passing time, he would run out of money, and he would have to leave Jerusalem without having attained justice for himself. And this would, on the face of it, seem to be corruption of justice enough, and the moral of the story is complete. Except it really isn't, because if you follow the Midrash on, the real heart of the story is what happens next. He's heading out of Jerusalem, and he runs into a widow along the way. And she, of course, is someone at much greater risk in society than he is. And she asks him she knows that he was going up for this lawsuit, and asks him how it went. And he tells her that he ran out of money, and so he didn't get anywhere with his case. And she says to him, if this guy, who is a man, and is someone who, when I look at the food chain of power in the society where I live, he's someone who has some importance. If he couldn't get anywhere with his case, what hope is there for me? I mean, it's just a guarantee that I'm out of options. So she ends up demoralized by his failure. She had nothing to do with the case, but she ends up especially demoralized. We, I think, ought to give sermons about that desperation, about the desperation that we are part of engendering when we just accept as unavoidable the slow, creeping corruption of justice. Sooner or later, those who make up the underclass, whether they're widows, as in the Midrash, whether they're immigrants, as in the conversation that we're having here today, or any others, sooner or later they're going to slip into desperate hopelessness. And all the consequences of that hopelessness for us and for them are most definitely a topic for us to address at this time of year. The mere possibility of ever experiencing justice seems so remote to those who are far further down that chain of power than we can imagine. They can't reasonably be anything other than desperate. And so I would think, in connection with this issue of immigration for this year, to offer sermons about whether we really want to allow America to be that place of the Midrash is a really important place for us to go.
One concise question? Yes, Arthur?
It's more of a comment. I've always tried to speak political issues, the ethical side of political issues, and seeing the ethics to the political situation. I live in Arizona, and I spoke on SB 150 to 3 congregations. I found that I retired from Temple Beth Shalom in Sun City. I found that a lot of Jews have forgotten that they are immigrants and what immigration means.
Yeah.
And when I spoke on SB 115, which is the notorious Arizona law that profiles Hispanics, illegal ones, I was told that this is not a proper subject to speak at a Sabbath service, and a couple of people walked out. There was a black guy in the service, and he said, "You Jews should know what immigration is all about."
Right.
And there was one policeman there who was armed with a gun. He didn't use it, but it was a very uncomfortable situation. So I find that my congregation was polarized on this issue. I tried to speak on treating the strangers as a homeborn and dealing with the Torah and everything else, but it's so polarized that they just click. Now I spoke to my part-time congregation.
Arthur, we need you to be more concise.
They were favorable. That was in Scottsdale, Paradise Valley, more tuned to the sympathy of Rahmanis. I spoke to Unitarian Church on this, and they were sympathetic. But speaking on this issue is very, I want to speak on the moral aspect of it. But they're out there, and they've got the opinions already made.
Let me try to address the concern on 2 different fronts. First off, the Religious Action Center just had, a few weeks ago, a conference call for rabbis to help them prepare if they wanted to speak on this subject for the High Holy Days.
Where is that Religious Action?
The Religious Action Center, of Reform Judaism, I shouldn't say these things with the president of the POJ. Very good. The Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism sponsored a conference call in which this was discussed, and there was a demographic researcher who was part of the conversation that actually because I had the same anecdotal experience that you talked about in terms of American Jews being so distanced from their own experience. At this point, we've been here for too long to be able to feel the pain of the immigrant. I was actually heartened by the fact that he had pointed out on the call that statistically speaking, it's not too late for us to be able to trigger that sense of awareness in American Jews. It requires us triggering it. It doesn't necessarily happen automatically for them in the way that perhaps it might have a generation ago. But that leads to my second response, which is to say what I'm planning to do as regards that concern is story is not just for those who are suffering right now the indignities of the challenges to immigration law in this country or in this state. It also has to do with us bringing our stories back to life. And if you have an immigration story of your own when you're preaching, that really brings to life exactly how questionable your family's future was in this country at the time, whether that was a generation or 2 or 3 or 5 ago, when those who were courageous enough to come here first took their swing at that. I happen to have such a story, and I'm looking forward to telling it as a way for people perhaps to say, what happened? What do I know about what great-grandpa may have gone through in getting to this country?
Thank you.
Just to piggyback on the question of story, I think also if we can constantly find opportunities leading up to our sermons and leading after our sermons for people to tell their own stories, for people to not just, assume that they'll be touched by ours, which I know Ken's, and it is incredibly touching, and it models, I think, what's possible when we make space for people to relate to each other and actually tell their stories, because I think it's a very common experience that you're expressing. I really appreciate you putting it into this space. It's not an easy moment. So how do we bring it back into people's hearts and souls in their own mouths?
Thank you. Rabbi Simonds.
So prior to the rabbinate, I spent a few years working in the advocacy community in Washington, D.C. within the Jewish community. And one experience which led me to the rabbinate and made me very angry was we spent an entire day working on a press release. And it was the 11th hour, and the comment was, "We forgot the Torah. Quickly find a piece of Judaism, slap it on the press release, and send it out." And I refer to that moment time and time again when we are in our congregations and preparing for these moments, because I fear that's what we often do. And that's what gets a lot of congregants and a lot of our colleagues angry and feeling that where was the Torah? Where was the true Torah? So I think in the weeks prior, in the days of, the days between, and the days after, we have many opportunities, not just for sermons, but for teaching experiences in which we can truly teach our Torah, share new narratives. Whenever we talk about immigration, we often talk about the correct narrative of we were strangers too within the land of Egypt. But I think we can start prior to that. What brought us down to Egypt, right? What made us descend into our own Mitzrayim? Right? There was a famine in our land, which made us descend to a land in which there was a famine of compassion. And I think we often forget about that. And that when we think about the immigrants of today, as well as our grandparents and great-grandparents, they came to the land because there was a famine. Either a famine of food, a famine of money, or a famine of compassion. And when they come to this new land, are we going to be the Egyptians and put upon them a famine of compassion? And so I think when we talk about immigration, it's just not we know what it was like to be strangers in a strange land, but we know what it was like to travel from a land in which we were starving to find a new kind of starvation in a new land. So when we offer these kinds of sermons or these kinds of teaching during breakout sessions, it's a new way to bring Torah to this issue. But then we can even speak prior to that, and Lech Lecha. I know for me personally in the last few years, teaching Lech Lecha has always been a beautiful spiritual journey, right? How we go inward. But if we truly look at Lech Lecha, it was trying to find, or being called to a new land, right? For a better life for one's family. And if that's not the immigration story, both of our ancestors and of modern day immigrants, then I don't know what is, right? Being almost called to take a holy journey, what could be more holy than finding a better life for you, for your kids, and for the generation yet to be known? And so in a sense, the modern day immigrants are going through their own Lech Lecha. They're going to a land unknown, but a land in which they hope, they've been taught that there's this promise, right? That they will enter a land which will be flowing with milk and honey, that they will be able to go to this land in which their generation will be as numerous as the stars, right? This hope of a better life in a new land, this holy journey. And so when we think about the narrative for the High Holy Days, the narrative for immigration in terms of our preaching and in terms of our breakout session teachings, I want to push us not just to focus on the fact that we were strangers, but our own journey, not out of slavery, but how we had this hope of going to a new land. And if we think about then the days of awe, the days of repentance, or the days of turning, or the days of returning, right? In a sense, people are returning hopefully for a new life, right? A life renewed. And when we think about the High Holy Days, we ask that for ourselves and for our neighbors and for our community. But when we think about the immigrant story, they're seeking true days of awe, right? They're seeking a true return, a return to the life that I think God promises all of us when we're born. They're almost trying to, have this rebirth, have this mikvah experience, some of them literally crossing through the waters to get through. And so when we offer these teachings, when we offer these preachings, it could be a moment to offer new concepts, new spins on old narratives that so many of us have known and so many of our congregants have known, but this is a new way. So it's not just slap the Torah on at the last minute, but really this is infused in our own Torah.
Thank you. One concise question of Joel?
I just want to tell you that I came with desperation and for inspiration, and I want to thank you because of the inspiration. I'm still in desperation with the whole issue and some of the issues that were raised. The one time that I talked about immigration, in myself an immigrant, I had some negative reactions there. I loved everything that he said, but we are, as Rabbi Levy said, Ivrim, but we choose to be Ivrim. We are the ones who cross the river to go, as Rabbi Simonds said, to a land, because we have to remember also that people don't come here because of the famine, because they suffer economic hardship, but because they want to come to a place where they see the value system that they want for themselves and for their children. And that maybe we don't emphasize enough. We come to take your jobs away. No, we want to adopt your values. That's why we leave those places that are not only poor, but they're poor because they're corrupt. And that's one thing. But we are Ivrim. We are people that cross the river to go El Aretz Asher Areta, this land that was undefined. But we forget and we become Ivrim. We become blind to what we are supposed to feel, because this is our history. It's our story and our history. And we have to. By the way, I got an email, and tomorrow, literally, I'm going to try to escape from prison. I'm a chaplain, and I'm going to try to go to Bakersfield because apparently there's a big rally tomorrow. And to try to show this congressman, this Republican congressman from Bakersfield, what the values are, what we are pursuing. So I'm
We'll need you to be able, yeah.
so thankful, and I need to talk to you guys.
Thank
You're
you.
the boss, so I'll talk to you. He said you're the boss. So.
Thank you. Okay. So what I'm passing out now is the are the list of al-Chaitz. And if we had more time, I would ask you all to go through the list and see which of these sins applies to our own or society's treatment of undocumented immigrants. Since our time is not so long, I'd like to sort of spark your thinking by suggesting how one can do a study session of the al-Chaitz from this perspective. or give a sermon, if you like giving classical three-point sermons, choosing three al-Chetz and talking at length about them. So, for example, the first one, al-Chetz shechatanu lefanecha ba'ones uvratzon. Ba'ones. We fit in unwillingly to societal stereotypes. We echo them all the time of who immigrants are, but we add our own from people we know, we think we know, who work for us. And the whole notion that stereotypes come in two categories of those that we sort of adopt unthinkingly and those that we add to on our own. How can we erase those? The second one, bivli da'at. You've heard today a lot of truths about the situation of undocumented immigrants. Are we telling those truths? Or are we passing on information which is not true, like that being undocumented is a crime? And since these are sins that we confess to, in this area there's something clearly wrong about passing on untruthful information. Galui areot. Steph mentioned, and I think all three of my colleagues mentioned, the domestic abuse, sometimes physical abuse, that goes on in immigrants' homes unchecked because the victims are afraid to call the police.
And at the workplace.
And at the workplace, absolutely, thank you. Skip down to the fifth one, Behonat Rea. These are our Re'im. These are neighbors. These are people whom are friends, and they are being wronged. Do we see them, each of them, as a Rea? Skip down to the second one from the end of that first list. Betumat Svatayim. All the ethnic slurs that we participate in. That we hear someone, as you have reminded us, who speaks with an accent. And there's a kind of tuma sometimes for us in the voice of somebody who speaks with an accent. My heavens, didn't our grandparents or great-grandparents speak with accents? Don't we speak with accents when we go to Israel? How dare we engage in that kind of tumat esvatayim? In the second group, belatson. We're latesing about this issue. It's their own fault. They got away with breaking the law. They should suffer for it. We are told not to sit in a moshav leitzim, and yet we engage in that often ourselves. The third one there, b'masa u'matan. We know about the abuses that undocumented workers suffer in the workplace by having to accept lower salaries and abuses out of fear of being caught and deported. But we provide our own workplaces. When we hire immigrants who are undocumented in our homes and in our gardens, are we taking care of them? Or are we committing a chet there in Masa Umatan? Skipping down several, Befrikat Ol. We are bound by the Ol mitzvot and by the Ol Malchut Shamayim. And we throw off that yoke when we violate the mitzvot about ways of of treating strangers. Bekalut rosh, not taking it all seriously. This doesn't really apply to us. So I would urge you to look down this list in those that we've omitted or those that we've mentioned that you might add to, and see whether this might make an interesting and powerful Yom Kippur sermon or a discussion session. There's an old joke that it's one thing to say in a farming community, thou shalt not steal. Absolutely, one should not steal. But thou shalt not steal chickens. Now there you're getting to attacking my own livelihood. So this is about not stealing chickens. This is about looking at the al-Chetz in a very personal way that affects us and that affects the whole society. So by my clock, we do have some time for some questions for everybody. I would only pray that you ask them briefly, or if you are making a statement, as that also be brief. Yes?
Don't you think there should be one more al-Chet on here for bilingual education? Because we'll see what the results is. So they're considered foreigners, even though they're here as children studying in school. When our parents and my father, my uncles, my aunts, when they tried to go to school, nobody offered to teach them in Yiddish. They became good Americans. And I think our people from south of the border can do the same thing. Don't teach them in Spanish, teach them in English.
So I must say, if I might respond to that, I think the fact that our parents and grandparents and us weren't taught in Yiddish
Yes.
was itself a societal sin. That I dare say none of us on this panel know Yiddish. That could have been prevented by a society. But what you're saying is each of us interprets these differently, and that's very important to do also. Thank you. Other comments, questions?
Have you used al-Chet for High Holiday sermon? You personally?
I haven't yet, but I've only been involved with this project for years.
Sermon, in sermon form, have you been able to? I mean, I can see a list of this, but if I go and repeat the al-Chet, I mean, it's kind of boring unless you're stealing chickens. So your sermon on the al-Chet has to be about stealing chickens.
Yes, exactly. And obviously, as you all do, you preface it by a compelling story. Yes.
Or else it doesn't mean a thing. It's just more platitudes or cliches, or it's just plain, rote liturgy.
Right, but
the skill is to take this and to form it into a sermon that touches people, not just to read al-Chet.
yes, I totally agree. Dara, you wanted to respond to that?
I was just curious, two of you have multiple rabbis in your pulpit and stuff. You used to work at one with multiple rabbis. Do you have any strategies? Is this topic for you going to require talking with your fellow clergy so that in some way it's not just my solo sermon has this fabulous impact and it's over with, but that the team in some way takes ownership or would take ownership? I'm just curious if you could just reflect on that part.
Fortunately, in our case, the other rabbi is not very interested in this issue, and so that takes care of. That's Rabbi Rachel Timona right over there. She's super interested in this issue and has been a tremendous pioneer in the work of Reform California. So yes, the answer is yeah. On all of these fronts, and especially at High Days time, we spend a fair amount of time kind of making sure not only that we're sort of in discrete territory, but also that the messages are sort of feeding one another, and that you go home, a minimum from each Chag, but possibly from the entire season, with a sense that there was kind of a through line between all of this, and especially because, using us as an example, because people so very clearly do identify Rabbi Timoner as a social justice rabbi. This is deep inside our gishkas, and they know this. It's important for there to be that sense that this is, kind of the terrain of all of us. And frankly, I would say even if it were the opposite, if this was something that was not really her province or her great interest, the entire success of this endeavor hinges upon all of us, whether as rabbis, as worshipers, as citizens, embracing the importance of our voice, joining with others. So I think I would say even if it's not something that's a matter of priority to both rabbis, it needs to be a sound of one large voice coming from the clergy team in order to affect the kind of change you want.
My senior rabbi is sitting right behind you, and Rabbi Roy Feinstein, who really put on this day, so the fact that of all the things that he's doing today is in this session kind of speaks to that. But I think in general, immigration reform aside, for all issues of justice, if it's not seen by the whole clergy, if it's not talked about beforehand, if it's not a synagogue-wide initiative, then I think it's a beautifully crafted, ego-based sermon. Really. I mean, if it's truly about social justice and about changing lives, it's not about the sermon. It's about the initiatives, and it's about what the congregation does afterwards.
At one point in Boston, we were in a campaign called Vote No on Question 1. It's a very catchy title, I know. And what we ultimately decided to do is I preached the sermon, and then the action ask was delivered by the senior rabbi, which was an interesting, so like I could preach, and it was Torah, and it was all of those pieces, and then I wasn't making the ask, but it felt like a through line. It felt like we, the clergy, were standing together to do a thing as a community, and it ended up working all right.
Good. Thank you all for being here, for your questions, and good luck.